The prophet and priest that wrote down this particular book of the Bible that bears his name, Zechariah, ministers to the remnant of Judah that was left over from the Babylonian captivity, for those of you that know some of your Old Testament history. Chronologically, chapter number 1 of this book of prophecy corresponds to the division made between chapters 4 and chapter 5 of the book of Ezra. So Zechariah is a contemporary, if you will, with both Nehemiah and Ezra and the post-exilic prophecies and prophets of that era. The people of Judah had been afflicted now, according to our text of verse number 12, 70 years, which is 70 long years. For those of you that are familiar, that is exactly what had been determined by God. 70 years of desolations. 70 years these individuals comprised of the southern kingdom of Judah, they were going to be held inside of captivity for their sinfulness. And so just as the Lord had prophesied, the southern kingdom of Judah had been hauled away, 3 different deportations, if you will, into Babylonian captivity led by King Nebuchadnezzar. And the southern kingdom of Judah goes in and remains inside of captivity for these 70 long years. Now, in case you're thinking this is just somewhat of a vacation, this was anything but a vacation. It began, and the endurance of the time proved to be very horrific in terms of suffering for the southern kingdom of Judah. They were afflicted. In fact, here the Bible brings to our mind inside of verse number 12 that the mercies of God had been prevented from Jerusalem, that they had been experiencing also in verse number 12 indignation for these 70 years. God had been afflicting them, which is another term that is used in this course, affliction, suffering. These individuals had really endured great trials inside of their life. Their identity, the southern kingdom of Judah's identity, had been stripped away from them, meaning that if you know anything about Old Testament Israel, they were known for the true worship of Jehovah God. And now all the heathen nations around them didn't necessarily perceive it like that, but they were different. They were different in their religion. They were different in their ceremonies and everything with their religion, which was the right religion. Everything around it surrounded itself to the tabernacle and then ultimately to the temple. That was the link made to their identity. In fact, in the wilderness wanderings, when they only had the tabernacle, you remember that the 12 tribes of Israel were to camp around the tabernacle. 3 tribes to the north, 3 tribes to the south, and 3 tribes to the east, and so on, 3 tribes to the west. Their lives revolved around this sacrificial worship system. This was the tie made to their identity. And so with the conquest and the siege of the city of Jerusalem and the desolation made not only to the city but ultimately to the temple, to its desecration, to the rave made upon the temple, and all the valuable items being hauled off and taken into Babylon as just loots, if you will, from the siege made upon the city. All of this really stripped away their identity. It violated them. I've spoken to people. I've had personal properties of mine taken and stolen at times in my life, but my home itself has never really been invaded, and the things that really identify who I am and you know, the personal and private things that I have in my home have never been ransacked and kind of rustled through and taken. But I've spoken to individuals that have had this happen. In fact, my brother and his wife had their home actually broken into several times, even with a security system that they didn't have cut on at the time, which is useless to have, by the way. But anyway, and I guess really what happens in that is you really feel violated. because who you are and things that you've worked for and things that mean so much to you have been taken and touched and manipulated. And so really you can hopefully start to see through that how their identity had been stripped away from them. And when they go into captivity, there's no more temple. There's no tabernacle. There's no sacrificial system. There's no more worship. They hang their harps on the willows, right? There was nothing else. All of that had been erased from their identity, what they had come to be known for and as for so long. They had lost loved ones in the deportations, in the siege. So many people had lost their lives and would continue to lose their lives throughout this era of 70 years. Religion itself for them had become just a series of behaviors. In fact, this is really where the Pharisaical mentality began to be popularized and spread out, where they didn't have the sacrificial system and the ceremonies to consume them. Now they really began to just focus on how they behaved and how they lived, and so focusing on what they could. And so religion really became this dull sense of legalistic, traditional, you've got to live and be cut out of the same cloth as I have been. And Judah, as a result of all of this, plummeted into despair. And you can pick this up in several of the Psalms. The faithful have failed, and just the questioning of God's mercies and His kindness, and where were they, and where was God, and all of this, and was God going to be able to revive His people out of all of this anguish that had befallen them. In verse number 12 of our text tonight, the angel of the Lord is mentioned, which I believe very heartedly tonight that this is none other than Christ Himself, denoted as the angel of the Lord. And this particular angel responds, answers, and speaks in verse number 12 to the Lord of hosts. And so what I believe is taking place here is we have an interaction of the Son addressing His Father. And the angel of the Lord questions the Lord of hosts inside of verse number 12, and he asks this question: how long wilt thou not have mercy on Jerusalem and on the cities of Judah, against which thou hast had indignation these 70 years? The question posed by the angel of the Lord here is, how long wilt thou not have mercy on Jerusalem? The question is addressed in connection to those that have been suffering a great deal, the southern kingdom of Judah. And the question poses, how much longer are they going to have to suffer? How much longer is this group of people going to be held in one of the most despairing parts and points of their history? How much longer will they be afflicted? They are the ones, these particular individuals that are now suffering, are the very ones that God has said to care a great deal about. In fact, they are His chosen, earthly, elect people. And they are the ones that, remember, that He has brought out of Egyptian bondage, that He has led even in their rebellion of 40 long years in the wilderness, that He had provided for them in every venue. He is the one that is said to have delivered them through every instance throughout the book of the Judges, raising up deliverers when they would cry by reason of their affliction. He is the one that even in the midst of them rejecting God from a theocracy and wanting to become a sort of monarchy set up, that God even understood that, but still turned time and time again and never completely forsook them in any of those moments throughout their life, because God is said to be espoused to them. He loved them. Jeremiah said that God loved them with an everlasting love, that He had chosen them, and that He hated Esau, but Jacob He had loved and He had tenderly cared for them. Even through, as Hosea would so eloquently point out, through their spiritual adultery, through all of their dark and demented deeds that they had committed, God was said to still care such a great deal for them, so much so that even on the auction block of spiritual prostitution, God would still ransom them and bring them back to Himself. But in the present hour, the present situation, such feelings from Judah's perspective have become very blurred. Where is this God that cares so immensely for me? Where is His mercy? Where is His love and His compassion? This God that I read about in the Scriptures, that has always been here. They had the law, they had the Torah. They looked to the first 5 books of your English Bible tonight, and they saw how God had providentially worked in Joseph's life, and they saw how God had worked in Abraham's life. They saw how God had worked through Moses' life and Joshua, and then they saw all of this, and they wondered, where is this God at that is supposed to care for us so immensely? Their vision of God's compassion and mercy had become blurred in their suffering. My hope tonight, and as we progress through the next couple of Sunday evenings together, is that we will begin to see a correlation between Israel's suffering and the trials that we have and will experience in this life as believers. And I believe we'll begin to see tonight that some of the same questions that you and I have had periodically through our life are some of the same questions that the children of Israel, namely the southern kingdom of Judah, would have had through moments of their suffering. And maybe tonight we can begin to find comfort as certain of these truths come to surface in dealing with our own personal afflictions, maybe things you have dealt with, maybe things that you're still dealing with right now, or maybe futuristic things that we will enter into as life progresses. And this evening, the truth that I want to surround us with tonight is simply this. I want us to recognize the providence of suffering. Recognize the providence of suffering. Now, there were several groups of individuals, several groups of people, if you will, that were to blame for Judah's time in captivity. This immense time of affliction and suffering and hardship and difficulties. There were several different groups that were to blame for Judah's time spent in captivity, these 70 years. First of all, we could say that the Babylonians themselves could be to blame, right? If Nebuchadnezzar and the kingdom of Babylon had not invaded Judah in the first place, then all would still be well, would it not be, in the southern kingdom of Judah? And they would still be fine. Daniel and the 3 Hebrew children, Azariah and Mishael and Azariah, those 3 children would have still been fine. All of the prince of the eunuchs, all of those individuals that were carried away in the first and second and third deportation, all of them would have been fine. Their families would have been fine. There would have been, the temple would have been fine. Jerusalem would have been fine. The wall would have been fine. Nothing of this sort would have taken place if the Babylonians hadn't have invaded the land. And next we could say the Israelites could have prevented this suffering themselves, right? It was, according to Scripture, their sin and their failures that brought the captivity to pass in the first place. This is seen to be a sense of consequence or punishment, chastening, if you will. This was meant to be a time of correction for them. They had erred. They had played the part of a spiritual whore. And they had wickedly gone astray. They had not been completely devoted to God. And in times of their life, they were the complete opposite of being devoted to the Lord in their life. And as a result of this, God had sent them off into captivity because of their sin. So we could say not only were the Babylonians to blame for the captivity, but also Israel themselves were to blame because of their sin. However, we are told twice inside of the book of Jeremiah, chapter 27, verse number 6, and also chapter 43 and verse number 10, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, is actually referred to in those particular verses as being the very servant of God. That's interesting, because Nebuchadnezzar is a pagan. He is a heathen. He worships anything but the true and living God. In fact, he's the one that gave the orders to desecrate the temple, to lay it desolate. He's the one that gave the orders to haul these men off, and he's the one that gave the orders to have the 3 Hebrew children's name changed to represent pagan gods and pagan forms of worship rather than their devotion to the one true and living God. This is astounding, really, whenever you consider that Nebuchadnezzar, this pagan king, is referred to as being the very servant of God. Unknowingly, Nebuchadnezzar had performed the very service of God upon the southern kingdom of Judah. And he is referred to as being the servant of God for this one reason, because he carried out the plan of God. for Judah. It's true tonight that Babylon had invaded the land. It's also true that Judah had filled the cup of iniquity full and God had poured out His wrath upon them, but it was none other than God Himself who had set their suffering into action instead of turning a blind eye to their sin, which He could have done if He chose to do. He could have looked the other way. He could have put in modern vernacular, swept their sin under the rug, right? He could have just let them go off, and there were times when God had let that happen, right? Of course, he could have done that. He could have just let them continue to fill the cup of iniquity fuller and fuller and fuller, all the while throughout history. He could have turned a blind eye, but He didn't. The cup of iniquity was full, and God had put all things into place, and at the right determined time, God had sent King Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Babylon Empire, into Jerusalem to lay siege and to ultimately destroy and haul off a remnant into captivity. It was God's fault, if you will. This is a pretty hard lesson for a lot of us to grasp at first hand, but it's also, I believe, to be absolutely necessary if we are to ever learn to adequately deal with our suffering rightly. Job eloquently pointed out that it was the Lord that had taken away all those precious things from him inside of his life. Now, his wealth, his children, his health, all of this had been taken away. And Job said it was the Lord that had given these things, and it was the Lord that had taken these things away from him. Now stay with me tonight. I want you to understand that Job could have said something completely different, and he could have been completely right in saying something completely different. Job could have said that it was a storm's fault. The storm took these things away. It was the storm's fault that my children lost their life. It was the storm's fault that all of my cattle, my livestock are destroyed. It was a storm's fault that all of my servants have lost their life. He could have blamed the infection. He could have said, it's the infection's fault that all of these boils cover my body from my crown of my head to the sole of my feet. He could have even blamed Satan and been correct. He could have said, Satan has brought this on me. Satan seeks an accusation against me. Satan wants me to curse God, and it's Satan's fault. The devil has done all of these things to me. He could have said any number of these things, and he would have been completely accurate to say all of them. But Job chose rather to trace his suffering back to the one who had given permission for it in the first place. And he said, the Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Now, why is it so important for us to see God's hand in our suffering? Would somebody mind waking Brother Destin up so he don't snore and distract everybody tonight? Why is it so important to see God's hand in our suffering? First of all, tonight, number one, it gives meaning to our pain. It gives meaning to our pain. Now, no matter what source, no matter what the immediate reason is for suffering. In other words, sometimes we are self-inflicted, right? Sometimes we suffer because we just simply make a mess out of things ourselves. We do that pretty well, do we not? We can make a mess out of just about anything. We can even make a mess as we attempt to do what's right. Paul said that even when I would do good, I find that evil is present with me. We make a mess out of things very well, all by ourselves. We don't need the devil's contribution. We don't need the world's contribution. We can make a mess out of things all ourselves. But here's the reality tonight. Here's the reality that whether we're suffering tonight because of stupid decisions that we have made ourselves, or whether our suffering has absolutely nothing to do with us and it was brought on by some exterior kingdom of this world, no matter the source of our suffering, to see God's hand inside of our suffering gives to our suffering, gives to our pain actual meaning or purpose, if you will. Now, stay with me. To some, the notion of God is a crutch for people to lean on. This is what some critics of Christianity say, that we naive believers affirm a belief in God because we are weaker individuals and that we simply need a crutch to lean on. We have to have certain answers that are unanswerable, and so we just attribute everything to God, and so therefore God simply becomes a crutch mentality. He is a crutch for us to lean on. Now listen, I am not objecting tonight to the reality that I do choose to lean on God, and He is a crutch for me. And I don't say that regrettably tonight. I am very pleased tonight to know that God is a strong tower for me. And that in times of difficulty, I can run to Him and I can lean on Him. Peter said it like this in 1 Peter 5 and verse 7, casting all your care upon Him, for He careth for you. But what I would rather add to that is God is not simply a crutch that I lean on, but I would go a step further and say that He is the very legs that we stand upon. That He is our foundation for which we are built. Paul said it like this, that it is in Him that we live and move and have our being. And God is the totality of our existence. Now, without God, pain becomes just pain. Without God, heartache becomes just heartache. There is no purpose or any meaning behind it or for it. It's just pain. Pain is pain. Suffering is suffering. Heartache is heartache. Think about some of the most horrendous things that you've had happen to you in your life. I address a crowd this evening that knows the pain of losing those that were closest to you in your life, and sometimes at very untimely times for you. Some of you know what it's like to face pressing financial strains in your life like some of us have never known anything like. Some of you know what it's like to have wayward children just wrench your heart until there seems to be no more tears to be shed. Without God, all of that is to absolutely no avail. It has absolutely no purpose behind it. It has no reasoning whatsoever. There's no rainbow at the end. There's no pot of gold. There's no nothing to be gained from any amount of suffering or pain that has been inflicted on you inside of your life. In such a worldview, self-destruction, suicide, becomes the best solution for many because there's no reason to continue going through the difficulty. And the only credible and easy solution out of it, since there is no purpose behind it, there's nothing to be gained from it, and self-destruction, suicide, becomes one of the best solutions because I have become my own God. I have become in charge of my own life, and the decisions that I have made have brought suffering into my life, and therefore to fix what does not have meaning, I can simply take my life and put an end to all the suffering that means absolutely nothing. Without God, suffering has absolutely no meaning. But if God is involved in our suffering, and if God is the source behind the permission or the allowance of our suffering tonight, then we understand from God and from God's Word that God does nothing without purpose, that everything has design. In fact, the Bible says, as far as humanity's structure in and of itself, that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. That is to say that there is a purposeful design behind our physical, biological construction. And that all of creation is said in Genesis chapter number 1 to have been created good. Good, day 1. Good, day 2. Day 3, day 4, day 5, good. And on day 6, everything that God had made was considered to be very good. That is very appropriate, that there was an intricate design behind all of creation. Even redemptive history would show us through the course 6,000 years of humanity's history would show us that everything, every move and counter move, that everything has a divine purpose behind it. That God is working towards a decreed end, and that nothing can subvert, nothing can change that end. We also see that in the purpose of redemption ourselves, that God is working all things together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to His purpose. And so that the sufferings and the trials and the disappointments and the difficulties and all of those things that are being brought into our life are not just pain. It's not just heartache. Peter would say it like this, that the trial of your faith, being much more precious than that of gold that perisheth, though it be tried with fire, might be found to the praise and the honor and the glory at the appearing of Jesus Christ. God gives meaning and purpose behind our pain. And number two, seeing God's hand in suffering also shows that something bigger than my little world is at stake. It shows that something bigger than my little world is at stake. Now, many times, suffering causes us to become very narrow in our perception. We only tend to see how we are affected in our suffering, right? I contract a cold, and all I care about is the fact that I can't breathe the way that I'm supposed to breathe. Right? And my whole world begins collapsing in all around me. You ladies can say amen. You know all of us men are wimps when it comes to, any bug or anything like that. And so all of us have the tendency that in times of suffering that we only tend to see how suffering affects us. Right? We become very narrow-minded, very selfish in our suffering, and we only care about what this suffering is doing to us. We only care about the immediate pain. We're very short-sighted. We would do anything really to alleviate the present suffering circumstances that we find ourselves in at certain points in time inside of our lives. And we only tend to see how we are affected in times of suffering. But understand this, that with God inside of the equation of our suffering, that God is not just working on our personal behalf. He's not even just working long-term in our life, which is something really premier inside of our lives and even inside of the Scriptures to know that the trying of my faith is working patience and that God is doing something for me. But understand that suffering has a larger perspective to it than just you or just me. If I'm going through a moment or time in my life where I'm suffering and something has happened to me that's just ripping my heart all to pieces, and I'm suffering in tremendous ways and almost to the point that I can barely put one foot in front of the other. Understand this, that God's not just doing that for your ultimate and futuristic benefit, but when God is bringing us through times of suffering, God also has a much bigger picture in mind. I believe the story of Joseph probably illustrates this better than any other inside of the Scriptures. Joseph was a man that was completely devoted to God. In fact, he's a great picture of Christ inside the Old Testament, in that there is nothing definitively recorded in the life of Joseph that tends itself to any kind of sinful behavior. Now, I'm not producing tonight that Joseph was sinless. Of course, we understand that he wasn't, but the Scriptures kind of overshadow the goodness of his life. And in attempting to do what was right inside of his life, Joseph is tremendously afflicted. And you know the story well, how his brothers had plotted to kill him and eventually sold him into slavery, and the progression of his life. And it seems there for a while it just continues to go down, and then there's a glimmer of hope, and he's brought up, and then he's put right back down. And as you read through the narrative of Joseph's life, it almost seems redundant. You ask yourself periodically, is anything ever going to work out for the poor sap, right? I mean, it just seems like everything is going negative inside of his life. He is suffering, he's afflicted, he's disregarded, he's hated, he's lied on, he's cheated, he's forgotten about. All of these things take place in his life. And we could say that God was just simply making Joseph a better man, and I believe he was. And as you see Joseph towards the latter end of the story, is he not a man? He wore a coat of many colors, but his personality outshined his coat that he ever wore. I mean, to be able to stand in front of your brothers that had set all that affliction into sequence, and to be able to say the words of, I love you and I forgive you, and what you meant to be evil, God meant it to be good, and to have that kind of compassion. Of course, we understand the role that suffering played inside of the particular life of Joseph personally. But the suffering of Joseph did much more than benefit him. You understand, God spared the world through the suffering of one man. Through Job's affliction that he probably thought at times in his life, questions like, why is this happening to me? Where is God at? I have trusted. I remember the stories about great-great-granddaddy. I remember the stories of Abraham and all that God has done for him. And I remember the stories of Isaac. And I know the stories that my father Jacob has told me. And we've worshiped and we've served. And I've done the best I can. And this is maybe how God has repaid me. And why, in a dark prison cell and all of the injustices that have been done, these thoughts have been quite natural. I'm not saying they necessarily had them, but there had been a tendency to have those kinds of questions. Probably some of the same questions that you probably have asked yourself in times throughout your life. What Joseph was unaware of is how God was working globally just because of the sufferings that he was going through inside of his life. To see God in the midst of our suffering is to understand that God has something much bigger that He is doing than just what He is doing inside of our life. You will never know the service that God is using you in to influence and to positively affect those around you, not just here at Fellowship, but the people that you work with, the community that you live in. That's why it is so important. That's why it's so important to retain your integrity in times of suffering. And then number 3, and we'll be finished tonight, to see God's hand inside of our suffering also gives a goal to be reached through our suffering. There should be a goal to be reached inside of our suffering. The Jews inside of captivity were very aware of the reasons that they had been placed in captivity. They were aware of their sins. They were very aware of their failures. God had sent prophet after prophet after prophet by to warn them and to call the nation to repentance. They were very aware of all the reasons why they had been placed in captivity. And while so many luxuries had been taken away from all of them, they were now forced to see their errors and try to improve them. They knew why they had been put into captivity. And they had seen all of these luxuries and all of these, if you will, side performances of their life dissipate. And there was so much now that they couldn't engage themselves in inside their life. There were so many things that they couldn't do. There was so much of their time that could not be distracted with the frivolous cares that they were so used to inside of their life. There was so much more time, if you will, on their hand to focus on what was really important in their life. Without all of these luxuries, without all the time for the extracurricular activities, they can now focus on the errors that they had made in their life and seek to improve them and make sure that history would not repeat itself. I've already alluded to this, that it was during captivity where the Pharisaic lifestyle began to be formulated. Without the ceremonies to keep them occupied, the focus became, in Judaism, placed on strict observance of behaviors. And now we often see all the negative implications and aspects of the Pharisaical traditions, but it does show that the initial willingness, it shows their initial willingness to correct their problems of morality. They begin to see the errors, and so they begin to create boundaries, if you will, inside their life. And so they would look at the Decalogue, and they would look at the Ten Commandments, and they would see that we're not to violate the Sabbath day. And so oral traditions would begin to be brought out that would say, okay, in an attempt not to violate the Sabbath day, we're gonna prescribe that a man can only travel X amount of miles, and you can only do X amount of steps inside of one day, and you can only do so much, preparation and all of these kinds of things. And so they began to build this boundary up and this boundary. And while this became a legalistic form of salvation, the initial willingness for them to do this just shows that they wanted to keep themselves from committing sin inside their life. And so all of this comes to us just to show that there was a goal. There was a purpose behind their suffering, and the goal behind their suffering was to make them morally better in terms of their service to God. During our suffering, we are often shown areas that we struggle in. These may be issues of trust. Maybe inside of your suffering you have found out that maybe your trust level with God and trusting Him that He does all things well, trusting that He's right, even though you can't understand His ways. Maybe through your suffering you begin to wrestle with the ideas of whether God can be trusted. Maybe in your suffering you've learned that you don't really depend on God quite as much as what you should. Maybe inside of your suffering you've even come face to face with moral failures, and you've seen that the reason maybe possibly while you're in some of the times of suffering maybe that you're in, or maybe you've gone through, or maybe you even will go through in the future, maybe you'll learn to see that suffering has come into your life because of some pretty stupid decisions you've made along the way, and you've kind of shot yourself, so to speak. We may not like the fact tonight that God has set the perimeters of our suffering just like He did for the southern kingdom of Judah. But what are we going to do about it? Who art thou that repliest against God? What are you going to say to God tonight? You're going to go to God in prayer and say, God, I don't like how you're operating, how you're running the show. And I think I'll take control back over from you. I'll take the helm of the ship. What exactly do we propose that we're going to do with God? Are we going to argue our way out of it? Or are we going to convince God that He's wrong? Remember Job's wife, her advice to Job? Curse God. Tell God how stupid He is. Tell God how foolish He is. Renounce your commitment to Him. And tell Him that if this is how He intends to govern your life, that we'll have no more part of His service. Job said, you talk like one of them foolish women. You talk like a foolish woman. Should we receive good at the hand of God and not evil also? He retained his integrity. What are we going to do about the fact that we don't like that God has allowed suffering into our life? Are you going to argue with the King of the universe? Like Jonah, are you going to get angry because of the gourd? All you're going to do is hear God respond to you and say, doest thou well to be angry for the gourd that you had no intuitive process behind in the first place? You didn't make the gourd, and you didn't cause the gourd to appear, and you didn't cause it to disappear. You had nothing to do with the gourd. Doest thou well to be angry? Do you do well? Does it make you feel better tonight to be angry with God and to question the very purposes of the God that breathed into your nostrils the breath of life? None of this is going to avail to anything. None of this is going to help us at all. It's not going to change our circumstance. We can get angry at God for allowing certain circumstances in our life, but this isn't going to change God or our circumstances. It's not. Tonight we would do better to acknowledge that God reigns, that He is sovereign over our lives, and that in the long run God is not going to suffer us to be moved. That He has not changed in His feelings toward us. That our minds are just not capable of assimilating and understanding His complete and ultimate moves and plan for our life. That our ways are not His ways. And our thoughts are not His thoughts. For thus saith the Lord, as the heavens are above the earth, so are my thoughts above your thoughts and my ways above your ways. God is, you need to mark this down somewhere. I was speaking to someone yesterday on the phone, and this word came into my mind. God is transcendent. He is transcendent. What that means in simplistic terms is that He is past finding out. You can't discover everything about God. And can I be completely honest with you tonight? That doesn't make me nervous. What would make me nervous tonight is that the God that created this vast universe, if I could figure Him out, and if I did understand everything that He understands, then that would make me real nervous tonight, because I know that I'm not on equal terms with a God that is capable of doing that. And tonight I take great comfort and confidence in the fact that God knows